Welcome back to the Advisory AI Solutions podcast, your inside look at how leaders solve the biggest challenges in construction, sustainability, and growth. I'm Jordan Salvador, and today I'm joined by Jonathan Wolk, founder of Wolk 360. He's been reshaping how the construction industry navigates the maze of codes, compliance, as well as regulations. So rather than accepting complexity as the cost of doing business, he's also pioneering a simpler, more intuitive approach to a way that helps companies stay compliant while saving time and resources. I'm thrilled to have you here with us today, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Appreciate it.
Appreciate you. So if you're in construction and you know regulations can feel like endless game, like an endless game of red tape and paperwork, the irony is most of that complexity isn't even necessary. So today we're hoping that Jonathan will break that down for us and why regulations don't have to be the bottleneck. But before we dive into things and get into the weeds of it, Jonathan, do you mind sharing a little bit about your journey and your background and how Woke 360 kind of came to be?
Yeah. So the 360 is because we provide real estate, architecture, and construction. And I started off as an architect, became licensed, then became a licensed general contractor. We're an unlimited licensed general contractor. And then I added becoming a real estate broker to it. So I carry 3 licenses. So if you want to talk about regulations, carry 3 licenses. There's a ton of regulations and they're all very different. And the professional associations and so on. But I think really one of the biggest benefits to me in the construction field is having the architectural background. And our design build process is architect led. And so that does help with the understanding of the regulations and the codes. And then as you go around every municipality, city, county, and then where you are in the city, depending on where you are, they have different zoning restrictions or requirements or submittal requirements. And so coming at it from an architectural background does help manage that process a lot better. We try to identify those surprises as best you can. And just because you did it a year or two ago doesn't mean you can do it today. And just because you did it in one municipality doesn't mean you can do it in another. And so a lot of it is doing that homework front end. And that's really why we like, as Wolk 360, to start with the real estate. So whether we're the real estate broker or we're working with the real estate broker, we can help identify what some of those issues or constraints may be in the due diligence process before you've even acquired the property. So whether it's a new construction or a renovation or addition or whatever the case may be, we can help identify at least some of those issues before, potentially even before you go under contract, or definitely before acquisition. And then from that, we can get into the architecture and the design and the planning and understanding what those regulations may be. What are the unique aspects of this project, and then put together a plan and a design that then can be executed by the construction team. So often the construction team sort of takes a hold of something after all these decisions have been made. They're not part of the decision-making process or understanding why some decisions have been made, whether it be regulatory or the client or the owner. And in many cases, the owner doesn't understand the regulatory process as well because it's not what they do. And so really for us, what we found is by providing a 360 solution really does help mitigate those circumstances. Now, there's always surprises. Every job has a surprise. No matter how thorough a job you do, there's always something that comes out. But it at least minimizes those surprises by being able to do that homework, if you will, and dig into it beforehand.
Well, that's terrific. You have such a rare background being able to have those 3 licenses, to be able to shed light and perspective, at each of those intervals of the phase of, construction from purchasing. But yeah, that's tremendous. Having to be able to have that insight ahead of time, to be able to reach a successful end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a person asked me one time, they said, hey, when am I talking to the architect? When am I talking to the real estate broker? When am I talking to the contractor? And I said, well, uh, you're always talking to them. And that's really the benefit. That's the added value that I/we bring to the table. So when I'm walking through a building or on a site with somebody as their real estate broker, or with a uh, cooperating real estate broker, I'm still looking at it from not just the real estate piece, but also from the architectural piece and from the construction piece. Is it going to have logistical issues? They want to put a pool in the backyard, or they want to do a 50-story tower. What are the regulatory issues that are going to impact that? What are the logistics that are going to impact that? And so it's not just looking at it as a parcel of land and what's required to close on it, but what does the future entail for the scope of what you want to do?
Right. So not only able to provide a creative design aspect, but then also what's actually legal and what's practical, within the realm.
And what do they want to do? So often, and sometimes the clients don't really know what they want to do, right? They see this property, they fall in love with it, they feel like it's going to work well for their business or their lifestyle or whatever the case may be. Whether it's an investment or a company headquarters, they're coming into it because they like something about the property. Maybe it's the location, maybe it's an existing building that needs to be renovated. Whatever the case may be, it helps them refine what it is that they want to do, what's the scope, but also understand what the pitfalls or potential issues might be coming up. We're looking at a project right now where they've bought a residence and they want to convert it to office. Well, that requires, they're like, oh, well, we need, zoning help to convert this to office. Yeah, that's just the first step. You don't just need zoning. You've got to convert this building now to an office building. So it was built as a house, and the layout may work out great for you, but now you've got accessibility issues. You've got fresh air requirements. You've got plumbing requirements. You've got parking requirements, setback issues that now are all very different for a commercial use than a residential use. And so it's always, now if somebody just came in and bought it as a house and they wanted it to be a house, there might not be any issues, right? Or just whatever it is that they want to do. But now by converting it to an office, that kind of opens a little bit of can of worms, and you gotta dig in and understand what are the issues for that particular property.
Right. Okay, so you kind of just touched on it. So most people, they assume codes and regulations, they are complex and, and the high volume of them. But do you think it's because they're meant to be? Or would you say that, they are often manufactured rather?
No, well, I don't think they're intentionally complicated. I think they just are complicated. I do think one of the issues that I find is that, building codes were originally created for, the health, safety, and welfare of the public. And they've kind of gone, much beyond that. Now it's about, uh, uh, it's about energy efficiency. It's about daylighting. It's about fresh air requirements, and some of those things may touch on the health, safety, and welfare of the public or the user, or the owner. But but some of it's really going beyond that. And I think that's where it tends to get very complicated. I think also there's really multi-level of codes and regulations, right? So I'm in North Carolina, and for example, North Carolina uses the International Building Code. However, North Carolina does amendments to the International Building Code. So you have the standard International Building Code that's used by 90% of the states, kind of untouched. But then North Carolina goes in and amends about 60 to 70% of that building code. So now you have a different version of the building code, which the whole point of that international building code was to be standard sort of across states. So that's the first issue. And then that changes every 3 years, but then North Carolina adopts 3 years after the new code is out. And so there's all these different versions floating out there that you either use or don't use, or is been accepted but is not necessarily in force at this time. Then you have, which kind of overlaps with the building code, then you have zoning regulations, right? And zoning really changes in some cases block to block, but definitely municipality to municipality, city, county, whatever the case may be. And so those zoning regulations may impact the building code. So where in the building code you're allowed to have a window, let's say, zoning may not allow you to have that window or that percentage of fenestration, because they limit how much glass you can have on a building or how much of one material you have on a building. So there's a whole nother layer that's not even building code, but that you have to get approved. And so that's a whole nother layer. And that's even more complicated, because that almost tends to be subjective, and that's really hard. And then you have national codes. So you have the accessibility, the ADA. Then you have FHA, Fair Housing Act, and you have other, all these other restrictions. So depending on the type of project you're doing, if you're doing a apartment project, you might have several different codes that you've got to address that aren't even the building code. And so you've got so many different layers of code and regulation that's the complexity of it. It's, if it was just one code and you could kind of master that, and there are people that do that out in the world, which sounds painful to me, but people do it. But it's really the layering. And then in those cases, there's a lot of times where they do conflict, or certain situations you're allowed to do this, but in this situation you're not, and so on and so forth. And so really it's really dissecting that through the design process. And that's really the difficulty. And that's why, again, from having the architectural background, getting into some of these issues, as opposed to, say, from a just straight construction, you really work through figuring that stuff out as much as you can before you're really, putting a shovel in the dirt.
Right. Well, just the fact that, you could take such a broad, level of code like the international code, and then just to, not gonna say willy-nilly, but deviate from it and customize it however you see fit. I could totally see how that could be, absolutely confusing for many, and then not to mention everything else that has to be intertwined and overlap, as you mentioned as well.
Yeah.
Um, so with that being said, what's the best way to navigate, through these codes and regulations?
Really, well, first and foremost, depending on the project, it really does help to have an architect involved, because that's really part of what we do is understand the building codes and the other related codes and regulations, and how they all intertwine in your specific project type. There are people out there that are just code specialists, code nerds, if you will. And they really just, and sometimes we use them as a resource. If we're in a complicated project where you have different occupancy groups and you have to have different separations and all of that, both horizontally and vertically, and say a mixed use project where you've got a parking garage, retail and office, and then multifamily, you've got to separate those uses. Is the building sprinklered or not sprinklered, and those kinds of things. And so when you start to get into that level of complexity, having a code consultant is very helpful, because that's really what they dig into, and they understand where this supersedes, that, and where this one takes precedent, and so on and so forth. Because there's, in the code, there's not just the code, it's then there's, subgroup 1, 2, 3, 4, and if this then that, that kind of stuff. And so those guys really understand that a lot better than some architects do. But if you're talking about a simple, straightforward project, then yeah, I think having an architect or even a well-informed designer is important. Somebody that knows the code is beneficial, or knows the questions to ask. Because again, we do work in a lot of different municipalities, and just because you can do it in one municipality doesn't mean you can do it in another, but you know to ask those questions. And so really diving into that due diligence process with curiosity, and not taking things for granted, not hey, because I did this last time. Even if you're in the same municipality, just because you did it a year ago doesn't mean that you can do it today, or just because you did it 2 blocks over doesn't mean you can do it there. And so um sort of taking that starting approach with curiosity, knowing the questions to ask is really the most important thing. Reaching out to the zoning official or planning department, although they're a lot of times difficult to get a hold of, they do prefer you to converse with them and go through some of those, so that they do have a level of understanding of what you're trying to do, and they can be very helpful in some cases. They're typically hard to get a hold of, but you've just got to be persistent. And but it really comes down to knowing the questions to ask, and where to go get the answers, because a lot of times they'll tell you, or the inspector will tell you something that they think is the case. But if you know where to go look for it in the code or the regulation, you can show them, well, no, here's either the exception, or here's how it applies in this case. What you're saying doesn't necessarily apply in this situation. And so really knowing where to go and get the answers is really the key part. And then in North Carolina, if you get into a situation or a conflict with the inspector, or something code related, you can reach out to the state and get an interpretation, and then they also post those interpretations, so that you can go and do your own homework and say, oh, hey, here was a situation very similar to mine, or just like mine, and this is how it was interpreted, and it could apply in this case. And it's a lot for those code officials to know all that's going on, and so you've got to do your homework and know where to look for those answers.
Right. So it's definitely mostly about having great questions, having an even greater source to be able to answer these questions. And I can only imagine how much time, resources, and headache that must be able to avoid,
Yeah.
and prevent
It's
waste.
really being curious at those introductory stages. You've got to be curious about the situation, or something looks um like, if something causes a question, or hey, this could be tricky, look it up.
Right, right. Okay. So, Jonathan, there's also a common belief that compliance is it's just the cost of doing business. Something that you can't even control. Do you think that's a myth?
It's definitely a cost of doing business. There's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. And the main issue that I take very seriously is you're really protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public, right? Or if it's a private thing, then the owner, right? And so um a lot of people feel like they want to do what they want to do, or oh, I've done this, so I should be able to do that myself, or whatever the case may be. But it's really about protecting the public, and so yes, it is a cost of doing business, but it costs to do things right. And really, I remember having a discussion with the fire marshal years ago, and the fire marshal comes into these things, and they basically dictate a lot, because their number one thing is, they're out there to protect the public. And so if they tell you to move a sprinkler head or add a fire extinguisher because it's a little further away, and they'll what they'll tell you is, relocating that sprinkler head might cost you a few $100s or $1,000. Adding a fire extinguisher might cost you a few $100s. but if it saves a life, what's that worth? And so really that's what it comes down to is nobody should get hurt because somebody cut corners by not doing something right. And so that is, that's a good cost of doing business, right? Is to do it right so that people don't get hurt when they're in a place that they think is going to be safe and turns out to not be safe.
Right. So it's not like codes are a necessary evil, but if you're doing things right and you are informed, it can actually become a competitive advantage. Would you agree?
Yeah, exactly. I think the last thing you want to do, let's say you want to build this cool little speakeasy bar and you're going to have 200 people in there, but it only has one exit, and there's only one way to get out. Well, one, for business, once people, it might be the coolest bar, but once people realize, wait, if there's 200 people in here and there's only one way to get out and that one way gets blocked, I'm not going to be that person that gets stuck. Guess what that's going to do to your business? It's going to kill it, right? Because who's going to want to be in a fire trap, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's some sensibility to that and a business model to that as well. I think a lot of times where people feel like it's excessive is when you get into you've got to have a certain sized restroom or where maybe life safety isn't such an obvious concern, right? So okay, the bathroom or the restroom has to be 7 by 7, that's 50 square feet almost. And like just for one restroom and let's say you're doing a small restaurant, you're like, oh my gosh, I got to dedicate that much space and that's going to cost me $50,000. And plus, now I can't put in this machine into the kitchen or whatever the case may be. Right. But that's where I feel like, although the building codes have gotten into to try to make these spaces for everybody and accessible for everybody, where I think a lot of times from the business side it's like, oh my gosh, this is a lot more than I need to allocate for this restroom, or oh, I've got to add a ramp to the front of my building for that. And so I think that's where the interpretation feels like it's getting to be a bit much. But backing it up to when you're doing the initial planning, you should have that all figured out in the initial planning and in the initial scope of the project and the pricing of the project, right? So it could be not just the cost of doing business, but maybe the person didn't have the adequate budget for the project that they wanted to do. And I think that's a lot of times what happens is people find out after the fact, and now all of a sudden adding a $10,000 ramp to the front of the building and could be more, but they don't have that in their budget, and now they're like, oh man, and they can't get a CO to open their business, and they've started paying the lease, and they don't have any operating capital. And we've had so many times where people call us that they've gotten into a building or they've been shut down, and hey, we're losing X dollars per day because we can't open for business because the fire marshal or the inspector shut us down. And it's like, I understand the situation you're in, but that's your fault for not doing it correctly in the beginning, and we try to help people out in those situations as best we can, because it does suck. But had they done their homework properly at the beginning, then they wouldn't have had that surprise.
Right. Oh, that would be such a helpless feeling as a
Oh,
business owner trying to get off your feet. But you're right. It's definitely something. If done right from the start, it could have been avoided.
yep, exactly.
Okay. So aside from thinking ahead, doing the proper due diligence ahead of time, what maybe strategies or tools have you guys developed at Wolk 360 to make compliance simpler for clients?
Really, it's establishing that scope of work that they want to do, right? So it really starts from what do they want to accomplish, and then as we develop the design, we're evaluating all these different things: exiting, accessibility, room sizes, daylighting, lighting, emergency services, all those kinds of things. And you really, by having a working knowledge of those codes, you don't know everything, but having a working knowledge in the planning process helps you lay it out appropriately. You don't put in dead end corridors, you don't put in an elevator that's too small, all these different issues that come into play. And so it really grows out of that initial planning process. And as you work through that, as you go step by step, it's kind of like peeling back layers of the onion. You kind of start at a high level, right? And so you don't have every question answered, but you sort of start at a high level with kind of some of the basics. And then as you develop the design, each time you develop the design, you dig in further and further into the code issues. And so, you might start with some of the basic stuff: restroom sizes, restroom counts, dead end corridors, corridor lengths, room sizes, windows, things like that. And then as you get into each level of design, so from schematic design to design development to construction documents, you hone in level to level into what those code issues are. And occasionally you have to back up a little bit because, oh man, we didn't realize that we chose not to sprinkler the building, and now we have a 75-foot exit issue, and now we've got to move a door, we've got to relocate a door, that's not in the right place to get them so they're both far enough apart and close enough together, things like that. And so it's really a very iterative process, that morphs as you develop the design and the plans. And that's really the only way I know how to do it. I'm sure there's other people that have other techniques, but for me, it's kind of like everything. You start at this, high level, and every step of the way, as you drill down into more and more, you refine that, both in terms of just the general design, but also the code issues.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it seems like a very practical framework to go about it for sure. Um okay, so Jonathan, looking ahead, say 5 years, how do you see the regulatory landscape in construction evolving?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different layers to that. I think, um, specifically in North Carolina, I think they're really trying to divvy up the residential and the commercial building code. And I think what they're really trying to do is simplify the residential building code, because it is a much simpler process, and builders, and it's not as complex as a commercial building. So I think that's one thing that you're going to continue to see, is the simplification of the residential code. Plus you have, big home builders and stuff that are big proponents of that. Um, I think the commercial building code is going to get more complex, because I think it's getting more and more, and I don't know that I agree with this. I don't know that I disagree with it, but it's getting more, I feel like it's getting further and further away from health, safety, and welfare of the general public, and more into how a building operates and functions. And so fresh air requirements, daylighting requirements, water fountains, restrooms, restroom sizes, restroom counts, things of that nature. I feel like are getting, the size of a building that you have, and how much, um, services that you have to provide for that building. I see that continuing to grow and get more complicated. Um, zoning and kind of planning regulations, I think, as place as these small towns, especially like in North Carolina, all these small towns have just boomed. So little towns that were five, maybe 10,000 people, 5 years ago are 50 and 100,000 people now, and their little main street that was kind of forgotten about now is really become this nice main street. And some of that might be because of some of the regulations they're doing and some of the things they're trying to enforce and make things look better and sort of follow a certain stylistic approach. But I have a real hard time going and presenting to a planning board of the general public that have no professional training and it's completely subjective, and they want you to add a window here, or wouldn't it be nice if wouldn't it be nice if this, or oh, I don't like this color, or oh gosh, I don't like that brick, or that's all subjective, and that's really difficult, and that is very frustrating. And we're designing an office building right now, and the town has all these requirements, like how much percentage of glass you can have, how much percentage of one material you can have on the facade, what pitch sloped roof you can have. And that to me is just going way too far. In both if you want to kind of take a libertarian approach, kind of like it's my property, I should be allowed to do what I want to do. And I believe there's some realistic component to that. There is, life safety and health, safety and welfare of the general public. But for you to dictate to me my roof pitch and how much glass I can have on my building, and then the variance can be approved by a group of people that have no professional training or even experience in design is I don't think is fair, quite frankly, and very frustrating. And then the owners are like, well, I want a window there. And they're like, oh, you can't have a window there. And they're like, well, why not? And so you get caught in this, as the design professional, you get caught between, trying to serve your client well, but meet the requirements of the jurisdiction. And that gets, like I said, it's highly subjective and gets complex. And it's really not fair to the owner that like we were talking about, right? Like we did all this due diligence. We bought this land. The land conforms to being an office building, let's say. And we're following all the regulations, right? The setbacks and providing the right amount of parking. Those regulations I can kind of understand and work with, right? But then when you get to the subjective stuff, it's like, well, what does that really have to do with the quality of building that we're doing? And that's the part where, kind of to your earlier question, like that's the part that gets really tricky, because you could be adding, if they say, hey, no, we want, we don't like this siding that you have, that needs to be brick. You could add $100,000-$200,000 to a project just because they want brick, or they want a different colored brick, or whatever the case may be, and that's tough to stomach, and that's your client's, that's real money. That's your client's real money. And that's and I don't think those planning boards and commissions either care in some cases or really have realization of that impact.
And I can only imagine how frustrating that could be. And, to me, it just sounds a bit of a abuse of power to a degree as well.
Oh yeah, and the thing that I find that's so this is why Clint Eastwood became mayor out in California, because of these kinds of restrictions, and he worked towards that. But what I find is, as you get into these either neighborhoods or towns, as they're trying to increase the exclusivity, they're also they also become more subjective about somebody else's property, which I find really an interesting conflict and kind of that sensibility, right? So it's challenging. Now, some areas, you go into and you understand that they have a very detailed and explicit design standards, right? And they say, okay, well, you can do this and do this. Um, and when you go into that community, you have that understanding. But when you're doing something in a town, or the general public, and it gets to that more subjective quality, that's where it becomes very challenging.
Right, right. Okay. Um, so Jonathan, as far as say scaling or growing Wolk 360, what do you find the biggest bottleneck or hurdle you guys are facing right now? And maybe how are you guys trying to overcome that?
I'd say probably the two biggest bottlenecks for us are really, the skilled labor force is Raleigh, we're very lucky. We're in North Carolina in general. We're still a very strong economy. There's a lot of building going on. We've got, great universities and schools here. And so we've got a good labor pool on the design side, on the architectural side. But there's still a lot of demand. And so being a small firm, competing for that talent is challenging. And then on the construction side, the not just not just good labor, but labor in general is challenging. Materials during COVID were a huge challenge, as everybody knows, but really now it's the labor, the pricing, and the availability of good labor. Good subcontractors, good vendors. It's tough. It's really tough. And we've worked with we're very lucky. Our crews have worked with us for years, but over the years we've replaced some because you know, they're good for a while and then they kind of, fall off, or maybe they get too busy and we get, we're a smaller player. So we get sort of sacrificed and they put their attention elsewhere. And so you do have to kind of refresh every now and then. But it's but I'd say, labor, and finding the crews that want to do the good work, be respectful of others' work, timing, schedules, quality. That's the biggest challenge. I mean, really, through the quality of our work, we post our work. We're obviously our website wolk360.com, but also on Instagram and YouTube and Facebook, and all the TikTok, all the things. Wolk360 has a page, and it we promote that work as much for new clients and to showcase our work to people, but also to attract talent. We get a lot of calls from people say, hey, I saw this project you were doing, it was really cool, I'd love to, is there an opportunity for me in your firm or your practice, or to work with you or for you? We get a lot of calls from subcontractors that see our projects going up. In fact, we're talking to one vendor right now that saw a project we were building, and he was like, man, that's really cool. We provide those kinds of windows and doors and things, and we'd love to see if we could be involved in your next project. And so I think by trying to have a high bar and consistently deliver quality work, is really one of the best ways to attract talent.
Right. Oh, I love that. I love your guys' values that you guys instill in your company. That's tremendous. So, Jonathan, uh, what project are you guys perhaps most excited about or proud of right now that's on the horizon?
We've got a few. Luckily, we're finishing up a really cool modern house right now for a client. That's going to look really great. We're literally in the starting to install flooring and light fixtures and stuff like that. And it's a nice modern house. It started off as a renovation addition, and we wound up realizing that as we were developing the design with the client, like at the end of the day, there was like one wall left in the from the existing house, and so it's like, let's just tear it down and start from scratch. And we're in the finishing stages of that, and it's coming along really beautifully. And it's really gonna sort of change, I think, the dynamic of not just that neighborhood, but the surrounding area. And then we've got we're doing a really cool office building that we're in the design stages that I think is going to be great. A cool church edition for an after school for an after school program. That's kind of a cool little thing. Um, and we're designing a new church, which is a modern take on sort of the classic little white, roadside country chapel. And it's kind of a modern approach to that. That's pretty cool. And then we're designing a very energy efficient house that with solar and heated floors and a lot of thermal dynamics that'll make the house very energy efficient. And we'll start construction on that probably here in the fourth quarter. So yeah, we've got some, we're doing some pretty cool and fun stuff.
Those sound like all four of them sound like wonderful projects. But that must be, it's still just a little bit of pride when you're able to start a project, put a building up, and then have that, the inspiration spread out into an entire neighborhood.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, people ask me all the time, why do I do what I do? And it's like, I really don't know how to do anything else. So that's why, and again, coming back to Wolk 360, that's really the idea of the 360, because it's really about that design and development process, and quite simply put, helping people make their dreams come true, whether it's for a business, a headquarters, a shop, a residence, a return on investment, whatever the case may be. There's always a unique element to what our client wants to achieve. And so that's really the beginning of it. Is what are those personal goals that you want out of this, and how do we help bring that to fruition?
That's so funny, Jonathan. Just because you basically took the words right out of my mouth, because this is the next question, and it's literally a question we ask all of our guests. It's, if you were building Wolk 360, what do you think you'd be doing instead?
Yeah. The only real thing that we're trying to do more of, to grow what we're doing, is do more of our own projects, so do things where we're the client, we're, say, the developer. We can build, let's say, some small 3 or 4 home neighborhood, or a small apartment project or something like that brings a lot of these qualities, but where we're realizing, let's say, the return on investment, or we're able to put something out there that people can just buy, as having to go through the design process and the code issues and the headaches and all of that, right? Because that's very frustrating for some owners, and some people just, that's not their thing, right? They're like, I don't want to, I can't envision it. I don't want to go through the process. I'd rather you build something. I like it. It looks cool. I'll buy it from you. And so, I think that would probably be our next step in growth. We've done some of that, but to do that more, I think, would really be our next step.
Awesome. I love that. Um, Before we wrap up here, Jonathan, I've really enjoyed our conversation. But where can our listeners find you? And I also invite you to maybe share a specific challenge with them that maybe they can practice this week.
Yeah. Well, the easiest way to find us is www.wolk360.com. It's WOLK360.com. And then through that, we're on Instagram as Wolk360DB, Facebook Wolk360. I'm on LinkedIn. We've got a YouTube channel, TikTok. So yeah, you can find us on all the platforms. Um, the biggest challenge, I would say, is stop watching the HGTV shows. You can watch them for inspiration, but whatever they say about timing and price, take that out of your. I was just talking to somebody about that today, and it's probably hurt our business as much as it's helped us. People They want to do a kitchen renovation, and they're talking to you, and it's $100,000 kitchen renovation, and they feel like they just saw it on HGTV for 20, and it's like no, and they feel like it can be done in a weekend. No. So yes, it's great for the inspiration and the visibility, but when watch it through the process, but when they get to the end and they tell you how much it costs and how quickly they did it, turn off the TV. um the other challenge I would put out there is, um I love like Dwell magazine and some of those things, Magnolia, what they're doing is really incredible, but I'd also challenge people to look beyond that. Like, one of the things as architects is we're not just looking at what's there today and what's trendy or what looks cool today, but look at some of the architects. Look at Walter Gropius. Look at Frank Lloyd Wright. Look at Louis Kahn. Look at Le Corbusier, um, and see the things that they were doing 100 years ago. And the stuff that Le Corbusier was doing, um, 50, 60, 70 years ago, today would still be considered very contemporary. And so I think open your eyes to what's more out there in the world. Richard Meyer is another architect that I love. Um, and I think look, not necessarily that you want to do it or even buy into it, but that's really some inventiveness and creativity and cutting edge stuff. And so I'd say, if you're considering doing a project, one, we'd love to talk to you and help you out. Um, but also part of it is look beyond just today's trends or the magazine, that you can pick up at the store, or look beyond, even if it's something that you don't want to do or you don't like. It's still just kind of, there's ideas in there that are beyond what we see every day, and very few of us are lucky enough to live, say, in Chicago, where there's, I don't know, 100 or something, Frank Lloyd Wright buildings or homes, and um things like that. Here in, Raleigh, North Carolina, it's challenging to find those really cool, unique projects. They're not commonplace. They haven't been here for, forever. People might think they're weird or funky, but if you look into them and see why they did what they did, there's some pretty cool stuff happening. And some of it may be applicable to your project, and some of it may just be, good to gain some awareness of what else is out there in the world.
Right. No, I think our listeners would be able to take that and find some real gold in both of those challenges. Um, uh, but Jonathan, you've showed us today that complexity uh, isn't really mandatory. It's not inevitable when it comes to regulations. But we also learned that compliance can be reframed from a burden into a business advantage. In fact, and that the future of the industry is less about coping with the codes, but more about designing smarter systems from the start. Right. So, Jonathan, thank you for
Absolutely.
sharing your insights.
Thank you, Jordan. I appreciate it. It's been great
Yeah,
talking to you. Great conversation.
absolutely. So, to our listeners, if you want to dive deeper into transforming your own business, check us out at advisor.ai-solutions.com or on our Instagram, advisor.ai.solutions. And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with someone who might need to hear it. Automate the ordinary and scale the extraordinary. Thanks, guys. Until next time.
Thank you.